Our second reading today, I hope you follow along, is from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 29 through 31. Just a short reading, 3 verses out of 1 Corinthians. Paul is saying to the Corinthians, I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. I'll get to some words about these 3 short verses here in just a minute that we just read from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. But first, I think it's important to put these verses in context. And that context being coming from the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. What comes before this short reading is part of something we do not very often read in its entirety, at least not in Sunday morning in Presbyterian churches. Remember, Paul is responding to questions of church members in Corinth and things he has heard about what's going on there. Chapter 7 opens up with Paul's instructions on marriage and sex, 16 verses worth. He explains the duty of spouses to one another and the reasons why one might either pursue or avoid marriage. He even gives his opinion on widows remarrying. Paul has spent most of this chapter giving instructions on governing the existing relationships and instructions to those that have been committed to these relationships. Then Paul moves to what is a bit more comfortable domain for us. He moves on to encouraging the Corinthians to accept their allotted station in life, except that it is not a constraint to their relationship with God, except what he assumes God has assigned them, except this is a situation in which they have been called by God. Slave or free, circumcised or not, Paul reminds all alike were bought with a price by Jesus. In whatever conditions you are in, you remain with God. Finally, in the verses just before our reading today, Paul's perspective on time starts to come out more clearly as he gives advice to unmarried and widows. He tells them it may not be worth considering marriage. Now, if read alone in these verses, the ones we have read today, Paul seems to literally pull the rug out from under all the message he has said up to this point. He spent time considering proper relationships, duties, and a motivation for marriage in ways that make it sound important. Then he seems to want to undo everything by pointing out that a crisis is at hand. He says, the appointed time has grown short. Paul's apocalyptic worldview takes over here, and it affects all aspects of life in his perspective. Paul worked with the assumption that the return of Christ was imminent. Christ would likely return soon, even in his lifetime, is what he thought. We have the benefit of knowing that parousia, the return, did not occur in his lifetime. Yet in reading this, we need to recognize Paul seemed to view this as something to happen soon, calls it an impending crisis. In our time, impending crisis, Paul envisioned, even expected, does not exert significant force on us. It's not a significant factor in our personal or our church planning. Even our current pandemic does not seem to be interpreted as a sign of end times. It simply does not carry an apocalyptic fervor. People continue to marry, continue to buy houses, and continue to buy stuff to put in them, and continue to socialize, even for the moment at an acceptable distance. Our present time has not raised the view of an imminent apocalyptic event of Paul's world. We do not get excited in preparing for an imminent return of Jesus. I'm not saying we necessarily should. However, if we are in our present time, do not share Paul's view of an imminent event, we can and should share his goal. In verse 35, Paul uses that or states that goal when he says, I say this for your benefit, not to put any restraint on you, but to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. Paul speaks to the issue saying, promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. Paul's words call for order and prioritization and action. One of the things he does, like Jesus' own exhortation, is to encourage putting stock in heavenly treasures rather than earthly ones, hearkening to Jesus' words out of Matthew, when Jesus said, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, but store up treasures yourself in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Shortly, we will have our annual congregational meeting. In Paul's words, the goal of our meeting is to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. Right now, I want to spend a few minutes expanding on that and thinking more about the purpose of an annual meeting and our annual report. Then I want to share some thoughts on ways we can proceed forward in our mission as a church. Now, there are, of course, obvious reasons for this annual meeting. One is to meet the legal requirements that we have such a meeting. We certainly don't want to get arrested for not having a meeting, and we don't want Luann, our clerk of session, to get chastised during the records review by presbytery for not having one. So we do it for legal reasons. Another more serious is simply to create a record of the activities and the work the church for posterity. It's good to have a record of who did what and when. It's good to have a record of the church budget, expenditures, and income, etc. It's good to have a record of our life together. With it, we are then able to look back and maybe even be inspired by what we see has happened. In some cases, if we look a ways back, we can maybe take some humor in some of the developments and some of the activities of an earlier era. In this case, it's a record of the reality of our time and our efforts, and that is good to have. Second, in today's environment, I think this meeting is important for transparency and accountability. In an era of limited trust or even suspicion in all types of organizations, not just churches, it is important that we can show ourselves and the rest of the world what we do, how we make decisions, and how decisions have been followed through on, and how our funds are spent. In addition, given the pace of change and mobility of people, I think this is critical for both the continuation and the smooth integration of new people and new ideas and needed changes. We simply need transparency. Another function that has strong biblical basis is that of lament, particularly in this now almost a year of COVID-19. We have legitimate reason for lament. Some doors have been closed. The physical doors of our church have certainly been closed. Some of what was comforting, reassuring, is just not there for now, and in some cases may not return. But as we lament, perhaps sing our own psalms of lament, I think we should go back to the form of psalms of lament in the Bible. Lament has 5 elements. Those 5 elements are, first, it's an address to God. Second, we can lodge our complaint or account of the misery suffered. Third is a plea for help. Fourth is an affirmation of trust in God. And fifth is a statement praising God. Yes, we can lament, but we need to honor our heritage and include all 5 elements when we do. Address God, go ahead and complain, plea for help, affirm, and praise God. Lament is part of our meeting. A final function I'll point out, and one that I think needs our prayerful attention and follow-up action, is that this meeting is an opportunity to look ahead, to look what God is calling us towards. Building on what we accomplish and have learned, building with what we are continuing to learn and the resources we have, we can consider what opportunities are being opened up to us. What is the vision? What are the next steps? Now, some say, and rightly so, that this may not be clear right now, at least not just yet. I know we do not yet even know exactly when we will all get vaccinated. When will this crisis really end? What will follow it? I hear you on that, and I assure you I understand that concern, but that should not paralyze us as a church. I also acknowledge that we may well be, in many cases, on the right track in many ways. But I would remind you of that old saying, even if sitting on the right track, if you're sitting still, you will most likely get run over by the next train. We can use this meeting as a stimulus to the imagination of our future. I'm convinced we can see opportunities available to us in the next year and beyond. We do, however, need to be strategic with what resources we have. Reverend Carey Nieuwhof, a leader in church planning, has some suggested ways we can move strategically in this digital age that I think are helpful and maybe reassuring, and that I want to share with you. Let me briefly share just a few of his. First, make decisions for today, not for forever. He says, when you can't see the bottom of a crisis, focus on making the best decision for now. Don't worry about forever. His second recommendation, make the mission your focus, not the methods. Now, our mission statement is on the cover sheet of our annual report. And if that's too long to keep all in your head, go with the tagline, the small, strong church with a big heart. Reverend Nieuwhof says, make your mission bigger than your methods. The third piece of advice is get innovative as quickly as you can. What you're probably spending a lot of time right now is on figuring out how to do what you used to do, he says. Instead, spend time on what you can do. Focus on what's possible, not what you've lost. His tag there is, If necessity is the mother of invention, crisis can be the cradle of innovation. The fourth, simple and real beats polished and professional every time. You don't need great production to get a great message out. One of the things he would note is the internet has flattened the world a long time ago. If you don't believe that, simply look on YouTube and all the things that you can see there from all kinds of sources. Lastly, he says, leverage your people to reach more people. Now, for years, we've said, you don't go to church, you are the church. That's taken on a whole new meaning when no one can go to the church building at this point. Now, if you think church online and using digital media is an obstacle, it probably will be. If you think online and digital is an opportunity, it probably will be. I think he has a list of some good strategies to think about as we move into 2021 and beyond. As of yesterday, we accomplished 145 years as a church. That was our 145th birthday yesterday. Today, we can set a path for what we celebrate in 2026 at our 150th anniversary of West Berlin Presbyterian Church. Now, in closing, let me go back to Paul's message for the Corinthians and for us. Slave or free, circumcised or not, Paul reminds all that they were bought with a price by Jesus. Paul says, accept today as a situation to which you have been called by God. Paul says, now is the appointed time to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. Promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. Amen.